Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, a very cordial good morning and a heartfelt Grüß Gott on behalf of the thematic group on education and solidarity. Kathy Libal and I are very happy to introduce to you Boaventura De Sousa Santos, who has graciously consented to hold another keynote. And he will focus his keynote on the Global South perspective on human rights. I would need a very long time to do justice to the work of this internationally renowned scholar, whose work on justice, globalization, democracy, human rights is widely and intensely discussed in many academic disciplines and transdisciplinary contexts. He is Professor Emeritus of the Faculty of Economics at the University of Coimbra and Distinguished Legal Scholar at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and Director of the Center of Social Studies at Coimbra. He holds a degree in legal studies. He studied philosophy at the Freie University in Berlin, and he holds a PhD from Yale. His dissertation, Right of the Oppressed, is considered a milestone in legal sociology. While at Yale, he came in touch with the civil rights movement and other social movements at the times, and he based his dissertation also on field work in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. He was given an honors doctorate by the University of Brasilia in 2012. Professor De Sousa Santos is well known for his concern with anti-hegemonic globalization and global justice of knowledge, on which his concept of epistemologies of the South is based. His research brought him to many different parts of the world, but particularly in the global South. And based on his research, he opts to reconsider theoretical and practical paradigms and focus on those that are conducive to social transformation. He's also one of the main initiators of the World Social Forum. It is a pleasure and honor to welcome him today on this precious occasion. Our subgroup of the Human Rights Research Consortium has read and vividly discussed his book, If God Were a Human Rights Activist. And we are all very eager to hear his talk today on how to democratize the human rights, a proposal from the epistemologies of the Global South. A very warm welcome to you, Professor De Sousa Santos. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad that you have made room for the sociologists to discuss issues together with you. I'm very glad to be here. Well, in a sense, my question is, for the title of my talk is a bit preposterous, because if you are talking about something that is universal, it cannot be more democratized, so to say. So it is by itself a democratic entity. Well, I tried in this talk to question this, and I start by some strong questions. I think that in our age, I would say that we are better equipped for strong questions than for strong answers. So I start with strong questions. Why so much human suffering is not considered a violation of human rights? Why so much destruction of life has been perpetrated in the name of human rights? Why so many people in the world are objects of discourses of human rights rather than subjects of human rights? Why the liberation struggles against European colonialism were fought in the name of other narratives and other normative principles other than human rights? Why so many honorable people have died risking their lives in the defense of human rights? At the current moment, in my research in Colombia, one of our struggles is to defend the life of the defenders of human rights. So these are strong questions. And I have to say that probably I don't have strong answers, because I think that we should try to answer them collectively, each one of us contributing to the best of his or her ability to find some principles of answers. In any case, I think that you have to confront three issues: the power questions, the epistemic questions, and the ontological questions. I'll start with an example. 2013, we are in Tunisia to start organizing the World Social Forum that for the first time was going to be held in North Africa. It was, the spring, the revolutionary spring, the Arab spring throughout North Africa, from Egypt to Tunisia, even Algeria, and many parts of the world as well, also in Eastern Europe. And therefore, we were convinced when many people, social movements, academics like myself, engaged in social movements, of course, from Europe, from Latin America, from Asia, we thought that the obvious topic for this, the general theme of this gathering would be human rights, because after all, human rights were arriving in Tunisia. Our colleagues from Tunisia said, no, never, human rights not. Well, it was quite a surprise in the group, because in fact, all of us were convinced that human rights was, in a sense, a good thing. Probably we have to question some of the ideas, but it's basically a good thing. Well, I think that I could understand very well that thematic, but that was another story. They didn't just want to speak in name of human rights. But we started the conversation, and this was a very, very long conversation. It took more than a few days, trying to discuss, after all, what should be the main topic. And it came up to the conclusion, all of us, that in fact we were speaking about dignity. After long hours of discussion, the concept of dignity came about very well. Well, they were of Islamic culture, and in the Quran, the word dignity appears very often. And by coincidence, or not so by coincidence, the indigenous peoples' philosophies of Latin America also have a key concept in their cosmovision or philosophy, the idea of dignity and respect. And of course, we consider that human rights narratives are narratives of dignity. So after long hours of discussion, we came to the conclusion that in fact, the theme of the World Social Forum shouldn't be human rights, but rather dignity. And that was the topic that was agreed upon. Why were our Tunisians so much against? Because some of you, and Karen was gracious enough to mention my If God Were a Human Rights Activist, published by Stanford University Press. I think that I could know why they were because so offended in a sense, because human rights had come to North Africa by imposition through the invasion of Napoleon. When Napoleon arrived in Alexandria, from his ship, he sent in 1798, he sent a very famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, declaration to the North Africans, saying to the Egyptians that, I'm not invading you. I'm not coming here to invade you. I'm bringing you the human rights. So human rights was an exercise of power, an exercise of invasion by a foreign power, and basically also an invasion, an occupation, colonial occupation of North Africa. So this is the context in which I think we have to discuss human rights today, because I think that there is a power issue here, and very often this power issue, the very logic of human rights does not allow to discuss the questions of power, because rights are what they are, humans are what they are, and therefore there is no question about that. But if there were no questions, we could not understand why the first 30 presidents of the United States of that beautiful constitution, all of them were slave owners or had dealings with slave owning companies. What was the contradiction there? Were they so ideological, were so insincere in their plea for human rights? Of course not. The problem is what counts as a human. And for them, at that point, slaves didn't count as humans. So there was no point in having human rights being addressed to them. So I think that in light of this, it was clear to me over the years that the human rights, in spite of their universality, or supposed universality, was in fact a top-down universality. And I was a bit suspicious of a kind of consensus that, the Tunisia event made me aware that this consensus probably was much less large than we thought before. And in fact, if it was consensual, like democracy, if everyone and the people from so many different ideologies purport to defend the human rights, contradictory positions in society, well, there must be something wrong. I think we should unpack the concept and try to understand what you mean by human rights. And in fact, it is interesting because when I asked this question about the liberation movements, were they less progressive because they were not engaged in human rights narratives? Well, there were other narratives on the ground then, narratives of liberation, narratives of emancipation. In fact, after 1948, the human rights became really a very important narrative. We know that. I don't have to go into that. It was only after 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that in a sense there was no other narrative in town, no other game in town other than the human rights. And therefore, we even thought that human rights from now on would be the end of history. Well, unfortunately, we are very much concerned about that because, in fact, it was not the end of history. It was the beginning of another history, as we know now. Because, in fact, at that very moment, we saw that human rights were being criticized by the very people that have been defending human rights. Neoliberalism, particularly from the 80s onwards, had been very critical of the social and economic and social rights and cultural rights, collective rights that had been involved, also already part of the narrative of human rights. And the reason was, you know, that of a 1975 report by the Trilateral Commission that says that democracy is overloaded with rights, and therefore we should unload it. That was the criticism of social and economic and political rights. So the human rights from then on were really, contradictorily enough, a kind object of many objections, so much so that even though the questioning of human rights began as, again, social and economic and cultural and collective rights, all of a sudden we see today that sometimes even civil and political rights are being questioned. And that's why democracy is in such a deep crisis with the rise of the extreme right in many countries, and why democracies keep electing more and more anti-democratic people, and in fact anti-human rights people. So I think there was something to say that probably this protagonism of human rights, I don't know to the extent it is a sense or a product of an historic victory or of an historic defeat. And that's the question that we should put. Well, if you really start unpacking the human rights narrative, then you have to understand, we have to talk about three binaries which are at the core of the human rights universality. The first one is the binary dichotomy between individual and community. And we know that human rights from the very beginning have a kind of bias in favor of the individual against the community. Well, it is very exceptional in the world, in a sense. Many other cultures, on the contrary, privilege community instead of the individual. And therefore, we have here already something that can unsettle us when we try to engage the global south in our conversation. The other one is the binary society or humanity and nature. against a binarity that hides an hierarchical relationship between humanity and nature. And of course, whatever is natural is inferior. Not just the nature in itself, in the Cartesian tradition, but also everything that is closer to nature. That's why women were closer to nature than men, and the indigenous people, the natives, were also closer to nature. That's why Hobbes in the Leviathan called them the naturals, because they were so close to nature. So this binary is also very problematic when we engage other cultures. Finally, we have the binary of the immanent and the transcendent. In societies in which secularism has been basic, of course, it makes all sense, and the transcendent calls for the idea of religion, of the sacredness, and so on. But in fact, in many other cultures, the transcendent is part of the immanent, is a kind of a dimension of it. It's an extra a dimension which we could call spirituality. So if this is so, let's see what we can, in fact, start thinking about the human rights if you try to understand the narrative of human rights without discarding it. I consider myself from the very beginning of my life, and particularly because I lived under dictatorship in my mature life in Portugal until 1974, I consider myself an activist of human rights, of course. But everyone that is engaged in human rights, both theoretically and in practice, has to unpack the concepts, because otherwise it could be a kind of an illusion and it could be something actually wrong. That's why I think that if you try to unpack the concept, we stumble immediately with the concept of universality. What is universality? It's something that is valid irrespective of the context. Whatever is valid irrespective of the context is very questionable. So that's why we have to probably not to decontextualize the human rights, but recontextualize them and inside and among many other narratives of dignity that exist in our world. And therefore, there is no question of discarding human rights. On the contrary, is to rebuild, refine them in intercultural terms. And in fact, very early on, already in the 90s, I wrote some pieces on an intercultural conception of human rights, which are based on my dialogues with a dear colleague, an Islamic colleague from the United States, Abdul Ahmed Nahim, what was a very good friend, tried to engage from the Islamic perspective the concept of human rights, particularly on the basis of the concept of Ummah, which is, of course, a key concept in human rights. So after addressing these questions of power, as I mentioned to you, I said that probably interculturality is not enough. And I think we have to move a bit beyond that, because if there is a question of power, there is a question of resistance. Why so many honorable people risk their lives in defense of human rights, as they are doing now all over the world? Well, it's because the human rights can also be used as a weapon of resistance of the weak. And therefore, this is the conception which I always try to engage with. And that's why we have been distinguished between hegemonic and the counter-hegemonic conceptions of human rights. And the intercultural conception of human rights aimed at being a kind of counter-hegemonic conception of human rights. So, but you have to conceptualize the resistance. Because if in fact there is a question of power, there is a question of resistance, to what extent can human rights be used as a strategy or a weapon or an instrument of resistance? First of all, we have to understand against which is the resistance. So we have to have a kind of a theoretical understanding of domination in our societies. It took me a long time to come to the conclusion that probably by my Marxist training originally, not in Germany, in West Germany, but at Yale, that in fact, probably our societies are not just capitalists. They are also colonialists, and they are patriarchal. And therefore, there are three main modes of domination that go together. Capitalism cannot exist without colonialism. It cannot exist without patriarchy. We may have victories against racism and against patriarchy, but in fact, the three modes of domination work in tandem. Why? For a very simple reason, is that free labor, which is the basic of capitalist domination, cannot sustain itself without highly developed labor or non-paid labor. Racialized bodies, sexualized bodies are the ones that provide highly developed labor and unpaid labor. And this is absolutely fundamental for the workings of society. I have analyzed in several societies that whenever capitalism becomes strongest, racism also increases. For instance, now in Brazil, capitalism is more aggressive, more savage now. Labor rights have been eroded, discarded, etc. All of a sudden, we have more of a genocide against the youth black people in the peripheries of the cities, and more feminicides, while gender violence has also increased. So they work in articulation. And in fact, the drama of our time is that while power acts articulated, resistance is always fragmented. There are many anti-capitalist movements, or there were many anti-capitalist movements that were racist and sexist. And there are many feminist groups that are racists and are pro-capitalist. And there are anti-racist movements that are anti-feminist, they are sexist, and they are pro-capitalist. Well, as long as domination goes articulated and resistance is fragmented, well, we don't live these modes of domination. That for many people in the world is hell, and for others is reasonably comfortable. So I think that if you engage with power resistance and power and resistance, you see that human rights can be used as a struggle for those that suffer the domination of capitalism, of patriarchy, of colonialism today as before. Because what ended with the independence of the colonies was a kind of historical colonialism. That is to say, colonialism as a kind of occupation by a foreign country. But there are many other forms of colonialism today: concentration of land, expulsion of indigenous people, black people, racism, of course, xenophobia. There are forms of colonialism. And since the 60s, many people, both in Africa and Latin America, have dealt with the concept of internal colonialism. So we know this. So these societies are this way. But if you look at prompt resistance, then you have to do the epistemic term. Because many people that resist against domination, they abide by, they run their lives by cultural narratives, by values, by philosophies that transcend or are outside the narrative of human rights or the Western-centric type of narratives. They have other values, they have other narratives, and hence the intercultural was very important for us to understand this. So I think that you have to see which kind of knowledges are these. And that's what brought me, as Karin mentioned, to the epistemology of the South. Because I came to the conclusion that in order to understand what was going on, I had to engage with the knowledges born in struggle against resistance. And that's why I came to the epistemology of the South, because there were two, and I have studied them thoroughly, I have to say, the two previous paradigms of knowledge in terms of struggle. Knowledge after the struggle. Hegel, of course. The howl of Minerva flies at dusk after the struggles. Well, the problem is that after the struggles, it's quiet, it's good to think. But what remains? Remains the knowledge of the winners of history. And that's why in our universities we have been teaching the history of the winners, never the history of the losers. And therefore is knowledge after the struggle. The Marxist paradigm was the opposite, was knowledge before the struggle. Because the workers by themselves, they were not progressive, they were not socialists, they were not communists. They had to be taught to be that, to fight for their own liberation. That's why Marxism was about, is to prepare for a struggle. But we had lots of disappointments with Marxism in our time. So I think that neither after the struggle, nor before the struggle, but while the struggle lasts. And therefore we have to try to engage with knowledge is born in struggle. That's a different way of knowing, because the knowledge of it is a knowledge with, not a knowledge about. And therefore, we have to be engaged in struggles of people, not a kind of abstract solidarity from our offices, but to risk our own lives sometimes. Some of my students are risking their lives in Cali now, struggling together with the youth that are fighting against a state of exception that now rules in Colombia. So if you look at this, knowledge is important struggle, then you start questioning the concepts, the binaries that I mentioned to you. It is the first one, individual and the community. Well, it is the problem with other cultures that have privileged too much community to the detriment of individuals. We don't want to do that. We have to struggle for a kind of an equilibrium, a balance between the individual and the community. How can you do that? We have to engage in what I call the ecology of knowledges. That is to say, bring in all the richness and the wealth of human rights and bring it in dialogue and in an ecological dialogue, that is to say, internal transformation of each system so that it can be enriched with other systems that also should be get transformed by the intercultural translation, so to say, and bring in these conceptions. Why this is important? Because in many cultures, the concept of individual does not even exist in their language. A great African Ghanaian philosopher, Kwasi Wiredu, was trained in the West, of course. He was the first to call the attention that in Yaka, he could not even translate the Cartesian principles. I think, therefore, I exist, because the I is not there. Because I am with, I am from, I am here, I am there, but never I. And then we come with our philosophies, and now many people speak around the world of another concept of Ubuntu from Southern Africa, based the Bantu philosophy, but is spread all over the world today, in which the basic principle is that I am because you are. So I'm not an individual. I exist because you exist. Well, for those that are trained in philosophy, you could say, well, we see echoes of this in Mitzvah of Heidegger. We see that in Isham Du, the Martin Buber, but it's different. Or you can also see the traces of that in the hospitality of Levinas, but it is different because there is a spiritual anchor there of ancestral knowledge that we don't capture in neither of these other concepts. So I think that when we question this binary in this sense, it comes out a different conception of human rights, is that we cannot, and that is surprising for me also, for many people, why do we in our culture only speak about human rights and never about human duties? Is it possible to have rights with duties? It's not possible. But why do we speak? Other society overdo it in what concerns, I think Islam is one of those, in overdoing the duties side. So you have to, again, to have a balance, and probably no universal declaration of human rights is possible without a universal declaration of human duties. And now when we see more and more things that are evolving with new crimes against humanity, the new tendency, the ecocide, that is the most recent one, well, we can see that, in fact, this idea of human rights and human duties is coming up. And I think that's important. But the epistemologists of the South also question the second dichotomy. The second dichotomy is society-nature. And there you can see that, in fact, for many cultures, the Cartesian concept of res extensa, res cogitant, was really preposterous, was very strange. Because, in fact, nature does not belong to us. We belong to nature. And if so, how can we say that human nature is just some inert, as Descartes says very clearly so? So I think that once you start thinking about it, you unpack that, then you can see that the questions of rights and human rights have to be extended to other entities. because probably our universal conception is very restricted, it's very parochial, as a matter of fact. And that's why in 2008, the Constitution of Ecuador has 71, the section 71 on rights of nature, was the first time in which these rights, as human rights, rights of nature, was conceived of. And now you have in New Zealand has been promulgated very strongly, very strong promulgation of the human rights of a sacred river of the Maori people in New Zealand. And when the Prime Minister promoted this law, which was approved in Congress, and the opposition from the right came and opposed and asked her, a remarkable Prime Minister today, you have seen in the pandemic dealings most recently, asked her, how is it possible to give rights to a river? A river has no sex, has no head, has no arms. How can you do that? Well, and she asked in response, does a company has a sex or head or arms? So from the Roman law onwards, we have distinguished between physical personality and juridical personality. So you have fictions, legal fictions, what we call in legal philosophy, legal fictions. Why is it so difficult to think that a river may be sacred? Because for those people that live off the river, it is very important that it has rights. And in fact, the law involves a new thing that the impact of it is still unknown around the world, because there are millions of dollars invested in recovering the vital cycles of the river. It's not decontaminate the river, it's all the margins, all the cycle of the river have to be regenerated as part of this new legislation. So rights of nature appear, and I'll come to that in a minute, in a new light. But the third binary is also questioned, because we have thought that the immanent transcendent, that the transcendent is the religious, is up there in the skies. How can you make sense then that a river may be sacred or a mountain may be sacred? We have to engage with these other conceptions, the conceptions of spirituality that is anchored in the material life around us. So this calls for a different conception of nature.
Excuse me, Boaventura, I hate to do this. This is the worst job of being a moderator. It's very painful, but we are on a very tight schedule. And I know that, you have so much to give us still. And so I really hate to have to cut you short. But could I kindly ask you, to try to wrap it up so that we have some room for discussion?
Absolutely, Karen.
I'm so sorry.
No, sorry. I'm all in favor of that. In fact, I was coming to the conclusion because I was coming back to my idea, Spinoza, which is my philosopher, of course, because what I'm pleading is that when I encounter these concepts of nature, which are not the nature of Descartes, but they are the nature of the indigenous people, I came to the conclusion, and that's why I'm always against to make caricatures of the Western thinking, because that Western thinking is so complex that in order to criticize it, we have to know it very deeply. And that's why I came to, and I knew, of course, from Spinoza in the 17th century, why his conception of nature was so opposed to Descartes. He was a follower of Descartes, but he was completely against it, because I said, what crazy thing is this, that nature is just natura naturata, which is the concept of Spinoza. Nature is also natura naturans, but there is the vital principle of life. And therefore, for Spinoza, it's very clear that we belong to nature and not the opposite. And that's why, while the ethics of Descartes starts with the individual, the first chapter is on the individual, Spinoza starts with Deo, with God. But God is substance of nature. So it's completely different conception of nature. So I think that by doing these intercultural conceptions, engaging with analogy, with other ontologies, we can enrich and expand the narrative of human rights engage them in real struggles in the real world in which we live. Thank you very much.